Hello, everyone. Great to see you all joining. We're just going to give it a few minutes before we start, just to see if there's anyone late.
Yes.
So I had the settings wrong, so I've had a few people unmuted, but now I think we're good. So yeah, as I mentioned, guys, this is always the awkward bit as we give it a few minutes. I've muted Austin by mistake, so you're unmuted, Austin. What's your favorite? While we're waiting for people to join us before we start in the next 2 minutes, what's your favorite Dylan album, Austin?
Ooh, truthfully, it's gonna sound a little hokey, but it's the most recent one he came out with. It's called Murder Most Foul. It was very centralized around kind of the Kennedy assassination and very Dallas centric. It was probably one of my more favorited ones that I've kind of come back to multiple times.
Oh, very good. No, that's yeah. I wasn't expecting you to say that. Yeah, I mean, I listened to it. It's all right. The Murder Most Foul one is interesting. I mean, yeah, I don't know. It was definitely some of his better. Although I like the Tempest. But yeah, of some of his later stuff, it's up there. But yeah, there you go. I suppose that's all I'll say on that one.
Most people will always go to some of his stuff that was earlier on, that was like really kind of ahead of its time for what they were doing, but kind of helped develop the genre, right?
Yeah.
I kind of feel like this one was him reaching a little bit to do something a little different than what his other ones tend to be, and maybe be a little bit outside of that folk category a little bit. And I think that's why I kind of appreciated it. Mainly because when I saw him live, it was almost you know when he tried to blend rock music and folk music, and it kind of made everyone mad. And he even said himself it was like the biggest failure he's ever done. But when we were in New York watching him, he was kind of directing everyone playing with him. He was almost like the Trey Anastasio of folk. It was like turned into this jam band kind of folk music feel, and I think it was really beautiful. And I think, you know, if that was a genre that was really happening around his time, I think he would have gone that route, and I think it really would have been well received. But that's just kind of my opinion.
Yeah.
And I kind of feel a little bit of that ish in that newer album. It has that kind of, I don't know, jammy notes to it, very like sprinkled here and there.
Yeah, no, I can appreciate that. You just mentioned the performing live there. I mean, people can be quite critical of Dylan live. You know, it's endless touring machine, and you go, and it's always it's you know, never meet your heroes. It's always been underwhelming. But I saw him in the Marquee in Cork a few years back, and I thought he was. I thoroughly enjoyed it. You know, but maybe you know, if you're enough of a fan, you're just happy to be in the presence. Like, you know, as sad as that sounds. But yeah.
I mean,
for those, sorry, go on.
I was gonna say, I will say, I mean, he is 80 years old now. He was probably 78 when I saw him. And, you know, there were a couple, you know, I'm not sure which song he's singing kind of moment. And then I'd lean over and I was like, do you know what this is? They're like, I think it's this one or this one. I was like, you're a bigger fan than me. You don't know what it is. It's like, it's terrible. But
in his defense on that run, he's famous for rewriting his songs live, even back in his heyday, like, you know. So yeah, there is that.
But it is still really beautiful. Like I said, it had this almost jam band vibe to that whole folk atmosphere.
And before we start formally, just for anyone who's joined in, we're just giving it a few minutes before we start tasting. So if you're joining middle of this chat, you're not missing anything. We're just shooting the breeze. But we'd love to hear from you in the chat. Did you see the Scorsese documentary on the Rolling Thunder review?
I did. I think I've seen that one twice. Mainly because, you know, obviously with our attachment, we got to really get some people to sit down and enjoy it, and then technically enjoy a piece of whiskey with us, which really, in my opinion, the whiskey itself, the flavor is the story, but then you also get another story attached to it. So it really kind of like brings it all together. So it was really fun.
No, fantastic. Okay, well, we've been waffling for a few minutes, just waiting for, so a few people stragglers have joined. So we will formally start. So apologies for anyone who's sitting there bored out of their mind by that, thinking you can get to the whiskey. So welcome everyone. First off, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Luke Crowley-Holland. I'm the manager down in the Celtic Whisky Bar and Irish Whisky Experience in Clarny. We're the world's largest collection of Irish whisky, fantastic food, fantastic cocktail bar, ticks all the boxes. And we also, it's beyond Irish, there's Scotch and bourbon in the picture behind me, as you can see, a fine bourbon collection, including the 4 whiskies we have here. So if you enjoyed these samples and want to try them again, you know where to come. I'm going to pass you on to Austin now. But before I do, I would firstly, for those of you who haven't done these chats before, we want to hear from you in the chat box, in the comments. We want your questions and your tasting notes, your feedback the whole way through. And also, there should be a Dave on here tonight who's from Dublin, who was in the bar last night, and it's his birthday. So happy birthday, Dave!
Happy birthday.
And will Austin, I'll let you introduce yourself and the brand.
All right. Well, hi everyone. Thanks for coming and joining us. My name is Austin Millspaw. I am Heaven's Door's National Ambassador. I started with our company, just a little bit about myself, in 2018, the exact same year that we decided to put our liquid out to the public. I started as our first part-time ambassador, moved to our first regional, and now our first national. So I've almost been with the company since public inception. Before that, just as most, I paid my way through school, bartending, very much started to take the more academic take to the idea of bartending, studying beer, distillation, cocktails from classics to modern, getting the chance to do cocktail competitions nationally, internationally, doing judging them and so forth. And then most notably, before I joined the team with Heaven's Door, I actually was in London for Bombay Sapphire's most imaginative bartender in the world, where I ended up getting second place. Trust me, it haunts me every single day that I get to say that, because I did not win. A really good friend of mine named Carly Caskin won. Love her to death, but it still eats me up inside. I was that close. But anyway,
so you're the second most imaginative bartender in the world.
Exactly, and it's just I love to remind myself of that every time we do these. But let's get to the whiskey itself. What we're going to do is we're going to start with the whiskey, and I'm going to continue to tell you the story, just so you're a little aware of formatting. Hold on, Dylan, back on tour on Tuesday. Can't wait for the Oh, that's amazing. Everyone read what Alan wrote. That's kind of amazing. That's kind of a really beautiful thing to see. I did not know he was back on tour yet, so that is something that's really cool. But
breaking news from Alan.
Yeah. Breaking news for you here and now. Let's get into the whiskey. So for those of you that have your bottles, the first one we're going to try is our straight bourbon. You'll notice with our bottles, these do not carry age statements. We'll get into that later on.
So we have, just for those, we have our samples here. They're labeled Heaven's Door Double Barrel, Heaven's Door Tennessee Bourbon, Heaven's Door Straight Rye, and Heaven's Door 10-year-old Redbreast. So there's the bourbon is the Tennessee bourbon. Yeah, yes, perfect. Just to avoid any confusion in case people are going, where's our straight bourbon?
My apologies. But that is the bottle if you do end up getting it. A thing to note, you probably already know, but I still kind of like to do it because I don't know the levels of everyone's drinking prowess. A thing I like to do when starting to drink whiskey, 85% of what you smell is what you taste. Your skin is a beautiful natural neutralizer. So with your mouth open, breathe through your nose, big deep breath out. That'll clear your faculties and prepare you to taste. Give it a little nose, starting from the chin to your nose, tilting your head, sorry. Your most dominant hand is usually your most dominant nostril. That's just a little bit of housekeeping. I also like to do a little small taste and then a subsequent larger sip and chewing on it. Really getting into it all, shocking the palate, and then delving into those primary and tertiary flavor profiles. So with that being said, let's start tasting the bourbon. So as we talk about Heaven's Door, while you continue to sip the bourbon, we were created by 3 founders. One of our founders, his name is Mark Bushala. He was one of the original creators of Angel's Envy with Lincoln and Wes Henderson. At the time, a larger supplier purchased their distillery called Bacardi. He then left, not wanting to work for a large company. he kind of wanted to do what I like to equate as the new American dream, that continuation of your legacy, something that's yours, not the White House, picket fence, kids, cats, dog, and so forth. Around that same time, our other founder, Ryan Perry, who's also our master blender, was working for another large supplier called Diageo. At that time, he was one of the leads of their barrel department. So anything that touched wood, anything finished, and so forth, his department was working on that. He was also doing a little bit of blending at the time. He left for the same purpose. He had learned so much and wanted to take what he had learned and put it more so into practicality, but also at the same time, that idea of doing something that's not just this big corporate monster, but something more intimate that's a little bit more his. Around that time again, our third founder, y'all might not know who this is, Bob Dylan, actually was looking to create a whiskey. Being a huge fan of whiskey, coming from outside of Duluth, Minnesota, whiskey was always kind of a part of his life. It's just that Americana was just always running with him throughout every phase of his growth. He became a very avid fan, talking about the fermentation process, the distillation process, talking about where you're storing your barrels, how that push and pull is interacting, and the flavors. Very specifically, because we know he's a very well-written individual getting a Nobel Prize for literature, he really loves to describe those flavors. So when our three founders met, the original intention was some form of one-off. Bob Dylan was thinking, I'm going to make something that I really enjoy drinking. Hopefully everyone else does as well. And once it's gone, it's gone. But once all three founders got together and really started talking about the ebbs and flows of this category called American whiskey, talking about flavors that they really enjoyed and appreciated, they started to realize that their stories all essentially aligned, and they really wanted to tell this story 365 days out of the year. And then hence the birth of what we're trying today, our Tennessee bourbon, our double barrel, and our rye. When getting into the bourbon, the ones that you all just recently tried, I like to equate this construction of the whiskey to being a segregation of large grain and small grain. It is a high rye bourbon. That means it's going to be above 51% corn, rye, and a very little bit of barley. It is also non-Lincoln County. For those of you that are familiar with Tennessee whiskey, the Lincoln County process is a process created in 1830 by a gentleman by the name of Nearest Green. It was then passed into law that all whiskey produced in Tennessee, with the exception of bourbon, go through this process. And that was passed into law May 7th, 2013. A thing to think about, and the reason why bourbon is this, and you can choose to use it or not to. You can almost think of it as, bourbon was created in the 1780s. 2013 is when the Lincoln County actually went into law. You can say one before the other. You can also say 1964 is when bourbon became a native spirit to the state. And then the law was again passed in 2013. Any which way you kind of want to defend it, but we chose not to use the process. And essentially it's that blessing of the whiskey before it goes to the barrel, for those that don't know. Once you place once you do your heads, your hearts, your tails, cuts, it's taking those hearts and doing a single pass through maple wood burnt to a charcoal. Essentially, the idea is to try to control as many variables as possible when then placing it into your barrel, which is in itself this own live animal that'll do what it wants as the seasons come and go. But back to the whiskey, as I said, it's a segregation of large grain and small grain. I like to consider our bourbon as guerrilla art. That front note, that back note, fire like fireworks. It's intended for both the rye and barley to have an equal footing with the corn. And I really believe that it's quite achievable. You'll notice it's not as viscous and doesn't carry the same familiar Kentucky bourbon flavors, but still carries a nice savory viscosity. I'm going to be a little suggestive. So now you've had a chance to try it. So I'm going to tell you what I taste, and then hopefully that doesn't destroy what you've already tasted. When I try our bourbon, I tend to believe that viscosity comes in very politely and almost like a savory honey. For those of you that had a very hippie parent, when you had allergies, it was essentially a spoonful of local bee pollen to kind of satiate your allergies. And that's where I start to think the rye and barley come into play. About mid palate, it almost dries up and becomes a pollen-esque flavor. Then as you kind of get to the back end, you start to get those breaded spice notes. And it even has like maybe a light acidity really on the very back end of it. But like I said, all in all, it's a very beautiful and interesting bourbon. It definitely debunks preconceived notions of what people think American bourbon really is. But before we move to the next one, do we have any questions?
Yeah, well, there was one question from Henry on the ABV, and Franco wants to know what order we'll be tasting the four in.
So our bourbon is a 92 proof bourbon. When we originally launched, it was 90. We're very much, like I said, a small company, so we kind of play with our food and always trying to see if there's another way to make it better. So we believe increasing the proof would tell that story, that flavor profile story a little better. That's usually the antithesis of what some companies do. They usually tend to bring it down a little bit, and maybe that becomes a little more of a business option, but also maybe it's still a flavor option. We thought increasing it would be better. The order that we're going to be going is going to be our Tennessee bourbon, our double barrel, then our rye, and last but not least, we'll be going with the Redbreast. I'm not sure anyone knows about Redbreast or what it is, but we'll get into it. We'll talk about it. I hear it's pretty good stuff.
It's not bad juice. This is really interesting. It's kind of, you know, in a good way, has all those classic elements that you'd want from a good bourbon in terms of the kind of texture, the kind of vanilla maple notes. It's almost a cliche to my, you know, I drink a bit of bourbon, but not as much as I would Irish or Scotch. So, but I mean that as a compliment, if that makes sense. Like, you know, you'd be disappointed if it said Tennessee straight bourbon and it didn't taste that way, you know. But
right, completely agree. I said, it's a little different than normal, but it does have it still has those traditional fronts. So the next that we're going to be getting into, this is going to be the double barrel for everyone that didn't hear the kind of order. This is what our bottle traditionally looks like. So as I said earlier, our bottles do not carry an age statement. A thing to think about for those who probably are Scotch fans, we like to pay homage to the inspiration of American whiskey. Obviously, the char in the barrel was potentially the French. We're not 100% sure, but that is believed by many historians. And of course, the production of whiskey was inspired by Scotland. When Scotch was originally made, it was blended for consistency, as most many know, but didn't carry age statements. We really believe the idea of an age statement really, it created a preconceived notion of the older it is, the better it is, which is really not the case. Kind of a fun fact, Canadian whiskey was actually trying to legitimize its whiskey within an American market. And that's how age statements really became a thing on bottles. It worked so well that almost any distillate out there has some form of an age statement because it's geared in our heads that the higher the number, the better the juice. In our core line, we really didn't want to have that. We wanted you to delve into the bottle and really see for yourself if our story aligns with your story. And then hopefully you enjoy it as much as we do. So as I say that, let's try the double barrel. So neutralize again. Do a little nosing of the whiskey. And then do a small sip to shock your palate and a subsequent one just to chew on. So with this,
a lot spicier straight away.
Oh God, yes. The spice is very, very prominent. As you continue to sip, you'll notice that spice starts to settle a little more on the back end, and then you allow these other whiskeys to come very much so on the front and middle. So it's called double barrel because it's two different categories of whiskey. But when you're talking about the blend of the whiskey, it's actually three whiskeys. Two of the whiskeys are redundant. One is a separate category. So three whiskeys, 4 barrels. So 2 of the whiskeys are actually very, very high corn, very little rye, very little barley, same mash, same barrel, same char in the barrel. So why are we taking 2 of the same whiskeys? Well, for those that are aware, we're playing on the push and pulls. One of the barrels is taken from the very top of the rickhouse and the other quite low in the rickhouse. As you can be conceived, heat rises, they're gonna have a lot more different frequencies up high as low. You can equate that very loosely to front notes and back notes, if you will. And if you bring those together, you're really compounding the flavor profile. However, at this point, it's a little too viscous. It's a little too sweet, almost Wilford Brimley, if you will. I know it might be too soon to joke about that, but I still laugh inside. So what we do is we take, now the rye you have is a finished version. So we take an unfinished version of our rye and we blend that into at about 10 to 12%. Now this is blended by taste. So the variance will never be below 10, but might go above 12 at times. It's all about really trying to balance the actual blend itself. I like to parallel it very well to an old fashioned, a drink created in 1806, called what its proper name is now in 1882. The old fashioned is essentially that use of bitters adds balance and upholds complexity. You can kind of think of the rye to do the same thing. Now, the fourth barrel, we use a fourth new oak barrel at a level 4 char, and we place those 3 whiskeys in there for another year. Essentially, we're using that barrel as an homogenizer. No, it's not sitting at vibration to bind them. It's not an actual homogenizer, but the idea of bringing them all together in a singular barrel. As where the bourbon, I like to call guerrilla art, or double barrel, I tend to say sits real politely as a symphony. All 3s ebb and flow together, and you really kind of get into those notes front, middle, and back quite politely. Suggestively, you notice it's much sweeter on the nose. You get into the sip, those parallels actually deepen quite a bit. You start to get, instead of sweet caramels and maybe light breaded notes on the nose, you start to get toasted caramels, burnt sugars, dark cherries. You start to get all of these beautiful viscosities that hit in the front. But then right at the very end, as Luke said, the spice hit really aggressively in the first sip. But if you continue to sip, you'll notice it'll slowly settle just to the back end. And that's kind of the idea, that rye is a balancer. And I used to call it the bartender's trick, where when a bartender makes a cocktail, they'll squeeze the lemon on top and then usually below the mouth line, coat the cocktail, essentially a top hat and a jacket. But I now call it the Dorito effect for those who have read the book in 2015, because it works really well, right? It tricks you into salivating a little more, thinking you're a little more thirsty, and then what do? You start to sip more of our whiskey. But at the same time, it also resets the palate, because that acidic spice that happens at the end is almost a reset for every sip, outside of the fact that none of the whiskeys are chill filtered. So the fat will still stay on the top of the tongue and the roof of your mouth and grow. But palate wise, it's almost like a nice reset.
Mm-hmm.
Any questions? Did I miss anything?
Alan has a question about the bottle design, but we might come back to that at a later point and focus on the whiskey for a second.
We will definitely come back to that.
Yeah. No, I did think we'd talk about that at some point, but maybe we'll. Yeah. Jonathan says, "Whoa, that's dry, really nice." Brian says, "Tannic mouthfeel. I like both so far, and have not had much bourbon to compare." They're 2 really great comments, and obviously keep them coming, guys. We want to, people normally, Austin, in my experience, after the second or third whiskey, their fingers loosen up, like, you know. But you mentioned there, sorry, there was a lot of information in what you said, so I'm just trying to process it all. You mentioned about a finished rye and a non-finished rye, did you?
Right.
What did you mean by that?
The rye that we're about to try, which its traditional bottle looks as so. That's going to be our next one we're trying anyway, so it's a great lead in. Love the question. This rye is actually finished. We finished this rye in French Vosges oak wood. White wood from the Vosges region of France, sorry. And we do that to achieve a certain profile. The rye that we use to balance our double barrel is the same rye, but not going through the finishing process. So it's essentially its raw self, just being a balancing agent between the other 2 Tennessee whiskeys. But let's go into the rye and really talk about it and delve into this whole finishing process. I like to kind of equate the 3 bottles that we're trying from bourbon to rye as first for the bourbon, middle for the double barrel, and finish for the rye, and very directly finishing. Is that what we're going to be talking about? The bourbon is not finished. The bourbon is aged in charred barrels. So the definition for American whiskey is any grain distilled and aged in wood with a char level. For bourbon specifically, it gets a little more deeper. It has to be over 51% corn. It has to be in new wood at a level of char, and it has to be aged a minimum of 2 years. Our bourbon sits at about 5.5 years old currently, if that answers your question, Lisa.
Yeah, no,
Now,
that sounds good. But so is that why that is that one of the reasons why this is obviously the first one is straight bourbon? This one is just double barrel whiskey. It doesn't mention, obviously because you've married the different elements, you've the different cask elements. So
right.
yeah.
So this is called straight because it does meet the minimum of 2 years. If it's aged for 4 years, it doesn't require an age statement. But as I said, this one sits at 5.5 years old, almost 6, but we'll call it 5.5 because obviously when you place an age statement on any whiskey, the youngest year is the only year you're allowed to use. For those unaware. But with our rye is based on finishing. So we take about 6 to 7 year old rye. So obviously, since I said 6 to 7, we can only call it 6. We then finish it in a different type of barrel, white wood from the Vosges region of France. We actually take that delicate French wood, which is great for wine because it only really lets out a little bit of flavor, hence why it's perfect for wine storage. We air dry the staves 3 years, increasing the surface area, opening up those tight fibers. We also build a different type of barrel. It's a skinny, taller barrel. An American barrel is essentially 53 gallons, short and squatty, kind of like most Americans. I had to do that. But the French barrel is skinny and tall. It's actually 55 gallons. So where an American barrel will sit about waist high, a French barrel will sit a little bit, the cigar barrel will sit a little bit more rib high. The reason for that is because the wood is very delicate. We want as much liquid to it as possible to extract as much flavor from it. It's not charred, it's only lightly toasted, and hopefully kind of start to get those enzymes going so that we can start to kind of pull the flavor away. We take that rye, which very high rye and almost no barley, and we finish it in that barrel for about 6 months to a year. For those that don't understand the proofing process, our bourbon was 92, our double barrel was 100, and our rye is 92. For those that don't understand how that process comes to pass, what it is you take your master blender that will try the whiskey at barrel strength, which is whatever proof it is in that barrel. They'll cut it down below bottle proof minimum. So for American whiskey, it's 80 proof. So our master blender will cut it down to about 60 proof. That's to really only see the gaps in the whiskey. And then as you're trying to find the best proof, you'll kind of start to have this diagram until you find that sweet spot to where you're getting the flavors that you're looking for. Now, when we're doing the aging process and that finishing process of the rye, he only tries cask strength and below proof minimum to kind of know where it needs to sit. And he'll start at 6 months and then continue till, as Ryan Perry says, for those, if you have children, tell them to leave the room. He says, it'll be ready when I fucking say it's ready. And that's kind of the idea of how we age it. Like I said, it's 6 months to a year. It'll never be below 6, but it might go above a year from time to time based on where he wants it to sit. Now, I didn't let us try the whiskey, so let's do that. So
wait, before we come on to the next whiskey. Sorry, Austin.
Oh no, I was going to try that. We haven't tried the
rye. Before we try the rye. I said a couple more questions. Last time I did a bourbon tasting, I ended up on my arse after a few whiskeys. So we might just have one more question before we start horsing down another one. Just for those listening in who might be, I'm sure everyone on this chat knows this, but obviously proof to us, it would be ABV, which is half of proof. So if it's 92 proof, it'd be 46 alcohol by volume divided by half. Which is obviously the terminology we'd be more used to over here. The other question I had, you mentioned about the founders at the start, and you've talked a lot about the mash bills and the aging there. Could you talk a bit about you are building a distillery in Nashville, I believe, in my research I saw that is. Could you tell us a bit about that and where your whiskey is coming from at the moment?
Oh, definitely. So since 2015, so before we went out publicly, we started distilling a couple of different mash bills. We did that out of Columbia, Tennessee. So it is, for those familiar, a co-op distillation establishment. We actually own the still that we're operating out of. So that just produces our whiskey. And then we bottle in Memphis. We have not 100% launched our 100% distillate. So while we're in the production of getting kind of our backstops and we have enough to meet demand, we work with a couple select distillers where we choose each barrel by hand. It's not essentially a lot or a level, it's barrel by barrel, mainly because for those who ever have gone to a distillery, you'll notice you can try one barrel and the barrel right next to it can almost be day and night. It's just what that wood wants to do with the whiskey in it through that kind of come and go of the seasons. So we will, in about March of next year, be turning our bourbon into 100% our production. We do things like single barrel launches that are very, I think, centralized to the States. I'm not sure if that's correct or not, but I do believe so. But you can find it on e-commerce pages where you can kind of get your hands on it, because that's where we show 100% of our production as well. But like I said, we work very intimately with two distillers that we work with to build our core line while we're continuing to distill our own. For the majority, it's only about 2 different mashes that we've worked on, but in the entirety of what we've been working on, we have about 5 separate mash bills that are currently in production, and we're trying to find our way to figure out how we want to tell that story and utilize it properly.
We had a few questions there. Jonathan says, if it's sourced, is it MGP rye? I'm not sure what that means.
So MGP is a distiller out of Indiana. They are known for the majority of rye production in the United States. Most whiskey distillers, even if they have their own distillery, don't make their rye. You could probably get your rye from things like Dickel, places like Bardstown, but most notably and most realistically, MGP is your large rye producer. And yes, our rye is from Northern Indiana. And we didn't just throw liquid in a bottle and put a label on it. We really wanted to play with the flavor profile. So we can get into that, but if we have any more questions, I'd like to answer those first.
Yeah, Alan says, well, Alan's is a statement more than a question. He says, I'm not trying to last the full night out at Austin's pace in terms of keeping up with the first 2 whiskeys.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's yeah. I suppose you have to, pay attention to the poor souls who have to drink 30 mils of this or an ounce of this every time we go to the next one.
I do these at about a quarter. I do these at about a quarter an ounce per sample, because you get enough of the mouthfeel to get into it, but you can usually get through all 4 without really getting kind of put down and out for the rest of it.
Of course. No, he said it's a compliment. And Jared Kelly says, I think it's Jared Kelly. It's G Kelly earlier on the chat. It says, is there a big rivalry between Kentucky bourbon / rye? So
Kentucky versus Tennessee, everyone's talked about it. They pretty much use a very similar water source, which is that limestone water. Kentucky is noted in the 1780s for making bourbon, even though in 1764, bourbon became a native spirit to the United States and anyone can make it. There's 5 categories of American whiskey that can be made in the States, and from coast to coast, anyone can make it. However, Tennessee does not see Kentucky as a rivalry. We're just trying to make some fun liquid, and hopefully you enjoy it like we do. Kentucky, on the other hand, sees Tennessee as a rival because they believe they are the epicenter to American whiskey. They have this notion that if it's not from here, it's not good. But that's kind of an older school of thought. I feel as though younger people in Kentucky might not carry that sentiment, but the older generation definitely does, because I've had a couple of times where I've blind tasted some people in Kentucky and they're like, oh man, I love it. And where's it from? I was like, Tennessee. And they're like, oh, this is terrible. I'm like, oh, cool. Thanks.
Well, when we were chatting before everyone joined the chat at 8 o'clock, we were talking about misconceptions around bourbon briefly, and in relation to my father. And I think that's a common one where most people I'd meet in the bar would, even Americans and Irish people, would assume if it doesn't come from Kentucky, it's not bourbon. And there was one, I think it was Hudson Bay bourbon was up there, and they were like, that can't be a bourbon. It's not from Kentucky. And I'm like, no, it can be anywhere in America.
The United States, yeah.
Yeah.
And all the ingredients are from the United States as well.
Mm-hmm. Martin says, lovely flavors in the double barrel, roasted sugars and peaches. So yeah, there's some great tasting notes. Barry just wants to clarify that the Tennessee bourbon is the straight bourbon, which is they're the one same. It's just the way we print the labels. Jonathan also has a tasting note. He says loves this. I'm going to leave the dramatic pause. Oily and citrus in the nose. Another dramatic pause. Lemon, oil, ginger, nutmeg. So that's marvelous. Do you have anything to add, Austin, or will we come on to the rye now finally?
Yes, let's move into the rye. We'll talk about bottle design for whoever asked recent in the prior questions. We'll get into bottle design right after this one, because we'll very specifically talk about the Redbreast and its bottle design, and then why the other ones are what they are. But so as we said, the unfinished versus finished, not a finished rye, which is that Indiana rye, the Balance, the double barrel. But the rye in the bottle that you're trying right now is finished for 6 months to a year in whitewood from the Vosges region of France, in that very skinny, tall, 55-gallon cigar barrel. The barrel is called that for aesthetic value, not for any flavor it gives. It doesn't have a tobacco flavor. A thing to think about is before bourbon was created in the 1780s, whiskey was being produced in the early 1700s along the East Coast. Rye was very prevalent at that time, but also very difficult to use. So a lot of the whiskey made, you could say, fit within that rye category. So above 51% rye. However, because it's so difficult to use at the time, knowledge on distillation wasn't as vast as it is now. They used a lot of other grains. So it'd be so much rye and then maybe corn, barley, other tertiary grains that they had along, and all of that would come together to make their whiskey. A thing to think about with that is that it was much more complex. It wasn't just this dry spice bomb that usually sits over 100 proof as American rye is now. It's very bombastic and very in your face. I tend to say it's a little polarizing for some. But with ours, we wanted to use this finishing process to try to get close to this early idea of whiskey production in the 1700s. So with the finish, you'll notice its flavor actually doesn't influence the finishing of the actual palate. It's more so direct to the fronts. It's a little more viscous. It almost has these delicate sweet notes to it. Then you start to get these kind of phenols, vegetals, grass notes, and then even that nice spice on the back end. It might not be quite what rye whiskey was or whiskey was made in the 1700s, but I think we got really close to it. And it's a beautiful way to see a category a little differently. I think it's a pleasant debunking of preconceived notions.
Mm-hmm. No, you'd expect with the name, you'd expect it to be spicier than the double barrel, because that's you get that bit on the nose, and then it doesn't hit as much on the finish. So it's really interesting. Jonathan in the chat there says it love this rye on the palate. I'm getting clove, cayenne, ginger, with honey in the background. So they're fantastic tasting notes.
Beautiful.
Mm-hmm. We also have
I just want to take these notes and just write them down. I love it.
Yeah, well, you can. They're they've signed a disclaimer. No, they haven't. The Lisa Andrews says, "Hi, what's the Rhine corn/corn mix in this whiskies?" I suppose does she mean the mash bill you mentioned? Obviously, had to be more than 51%. Right. What's it coming in at on most ones you've tasted?
So with our bourbon, we can't really disclose too much of our mash bill. It is going to be over. It's going to be over 51% corn. It's going to be a very hefty amount of rye and very little amount of barley. With the double barrel, the two Tennessee whiskeys are very traditional. So Tennessee whiskey's traditional mashes are very, very high with micro doses of rye and barley. That's where that sits on those two. Same barrel, same char. And then the rye that goes in there is a very heavy dose of rye and almost a light micro dose of barley. Same to be said with the rye that's in the bottle. And it's that finishing that actually really bestows that flavor profile that you're falling into. That was so beautifully described by Jonathan.
Mm. And when you say corn, you mean obviously what maize rather than you mean specifically that grain as opposed to corn, the category, yes. that could involve more. And you can use wheat as well in bourbons as well, can't you?
You can have wheated bourbons that adds a little bit of texture to things. It also adds some smaller flavor notes that are really beautiful about midpoint. None of what we have carries wheat in it currently. We do have some things that might be coming in the future, but as things grow, it might be introduced. But right now, there is no wheat in any of what we produce.
Right. Um, and Alan in the chat says this is lovely, not too spicy as you say. Rye is such a different beast to what I'm used to with Irish whiskey. No, it definitely is. I still do use a lot of rye in cocktails, but it's only in the last maybe probably since the first COVID lockdown that I've actually started to really get into it and appreciate it as a drink. There's some phenomenal American ryes you can get out there. I don't want to drop brands when we're talking about your brand, but there are some great ones on the market. I don't know if it's changing in the American market or if it's changing what's available to us here in Ireland. But you definitely, even in the last 5 years, you see a lot more brands popping up in shops and in on wholesalers lists of really good American ryes.
Yep. I mean, I would agree. I think the rye category, kind of around the time the idea of the single barrel really took off, that single barrel really brought whiskey clubs together. And I kind of like to call it the third American whiskey boom. And with that, I think rye has really kind of taken a spot in that boom. A lot of people have leaned into the ryes. They've wanted to try the cask strengths. And those two really helped fuel that kind of movement. And I think they still are now. With ours, it's not that big dry spice bomb like most tend to be. I usually say, since we're talking cocktails, I say this works really well as a Sazerac. Obviously, it was originally a cognac cocktail, but using our rye because of those sweeter, delicate notes, it's a little more close to the transition from cognac to rye when that cocktail actually transitioned because of phylloxera. I also would say do not use an absinthe, use a pastis, because that was what originally was used in your Sazerac, hence why Pernod became so popular. Absinthe wasn't around, wasn't imported into the States at that time.
So wow, I didn't know that. I knew about the cognac, but that pastis is brilliant because I have lots of. I don't know why I go when I'm abroad. I pick up bottles of like Pernod or Ricard because I think it would be cool, and then I have them at home and I never touch them, so I can use them in the Sazerac now. So that's great.
Yeah, now you have a use for it. I mean, it was probably that cocktail that helped launch them, actually, mainly because they didn't have absinthe allowed in the States at the time, and they wanted something close enough to it. And so a pastis had a little bit of what they were looking for, and that's exactly what was in the rye Sazerac. And I'm almost certain it was the one in the cognac, but I don't want to misspeak. So if I'm wrong, someone.
Yeah. Well, this is a fantastic link chain that we've going on here because obviously it's Pernod Ricard who own Redbreast, so we've tied it all together.
I wonder why I did that.
Yeah, no, that was your skill. That was definitely not an accident. Yeah,
there might have been a purpose for this. But, so last but not least, one of my favorite bottlings that we've ever done, one of my favorite products we've ever done is this Redbreast collaboration. So for those who've not seen the bottle, this is our gorgeous Redbreast bottle. This is our Master Blenders edition. This is the mashing of two beautiful minds, an American blender and an Irish blender. And what I think really has come from it is something really magical. You're talking about a 10-year Tennessee whiskey that sat in Redbreast 12-year-old barrels. Excuse me for the noise. Redbreast 12-year-old barrels for about 15 months. If those of you are aware, those barrels come with sherry caps, and then all of that is then sat for 12 years, creating probably one of the better Irish whiskeys out there that I've gotten to taste. Now, for those of you watching,
you didn't need to qualify Irish. You could have just said whiskey is one of the best whiskeys out there.
See, this is things I need to know. Sorry.
No, I mean obviously it is Irish, but I think like in its price point, Redbreast 12 is the probably the best whiskey, euro for euro, dollar for dollar out there, like, you know, or at least top 5 in the world. But
I completely agree. But before we get into it, let's do the thing that we need to do, a quick neutralization. It's that big breathe out. It's like the only bit of yoga we'll be doing in this thing. So namaste. For those of you that are yogis, I'm not, so I just know that's what you say. Take that little sip and then a larger sip and kind of chew on it.
yeah, I'm a massive fan of that. But I've just for balance, you know, I've had spoke to a few people who tried it recently who weren't as as enamored with it. But I think they went into it as Redbreast fans expecting something different, rather than, for me, I went at it as a 10-year-old bourbon, which the Redbreast has added different qualities to it, and I think definitely that candy floss kind of wisp at the end always catches me and gives me a smile. Like, it's very good.
Exactly. I think kind of like the way you said it is, that's the best way to really understand this mashup. Don't think of it as Redbreast, even though it is a very major part of the collaboration, but see it as the base was an American whiskey that went in there. And then you can start to appreciate the beautiful like dosing that the barrel gave to that Tennessee whiskey. I really like to say it kind of, if you think about it diagram wise as flavor without being suggestive, is I kind of say it starts with the Tennessee and then it kind of goes like this, Irish and Tennessee popping at their own points. And then you kind of get, as you said, that little bit of the Redbreast on the very finish, which kind of gives you the aha moment, like, oh, that's why they blended it together. Suggestively for me, I always kind of start with almost like bright fruits. So I kind of get a little bit of apple, fig, then you start to get more traditional American whiskeys like marzipan. And then you even have that, like I said, that sweet finish. But I never want to say what it is because I like everyone to kind of go trail down their memories of things they've tasted and kind of discern what the finish is. Because I really believe that finishing at the very end of this profile kind of makes the collaboration what it is and why it was so exciting.
Mm-hmm.
It was really surprising when we launched this. Yes, we did give respect. The bird is on the bottle for those who know. But we sent the bottling out to California spirits competitions, and we sent it out blind. And it won double gold, and then required many answers because everyone was wondering why it tastes the way it tastes, how this happened, what is this. Because we just really didn't want to tell anyone. We just want to put something fun out, work with people we appreciate and respect, and hopefully it just became a cool little nerd moment for all of us. But it took off a lot more than it did, and has almost inspired another master blend series that might be coming out soon. We haven't quite figured out what it'll be yet, but it might have inspired other fun collaborations like this. Just trying to mess around.
That ties in with Barry's question there about, is there any future partnerships planned between Redbreast Irish Distillers? And I suppose you were obviously hinting at the fact that there will be there, is it?
There definitely will be. There definitely will be another blender to blender. I don't know if it'll be a blender to Irish blender. That we have not confirmed yet. We're kind of more in the planning phase of it. So obviously it probably won't be seen next year, but will be seen the following. So, if you're going to guesstimate, probably every 2 years that'll come out. Because we got to get the planning down, get those logistics in, agree with their team, and then obviously bottle the really non-poetic side of it. But usually the partnerships come out to being something quite magical. And I think this one really hit the nail on the head.
No, fantastic. We look forward to that. We've two other questions. Alan says, any idea of how many bottles were released? Do you know what the volume of this release was?
Give me 2 seconds. I'm going to cheat because I used to know right offhand, but I don't right now.
While you're looking there, Martin Fade has a tasting note. He says it's surprising. It smells sweet, but it's nutty on the palate. While you're looking at that, I have a question of my own, which has come up a lot with people I spoke to about this whiskey. As I said, it generated a lot of excitement when it was announced and finally came over here. This is going to highlight my ignorance on bourbon, but the idea that bourbon is obviously a specific mash bill, specific distillation process, a specific aging in charred oak, it has to be virgin American oak and all that. How are bourbon finishes allowed? How does that work within the category in terms of being able to call it a bourbon?
So the finishing is considered just something secondary. To qualify to be any one of those 5 categories, you have to meet all of those requirements first. So
Hmm.
once you meet all of those requirements, you can then do any other like finishings and things like that,
Mm.
double finishings or other things. Like some people have taken a distillate and aged it the minimum of 2 years in one barrel and then moved it to another barrel for 4 years. Some people have let it mature to be about 5 years old and throw it in a finishing barrel for 15 months.
Hmm.
But the major requirement is to meet those minimum requirements to categorize yourself in one of the 5 categories. So once you've done that, you can then start to kind of move to any other uh, complexities you want to add
Hmm.
with within that regard, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. In that, but in that regards, I'm surprised that we don't see more sort of, kind of interesting cast finish bourbons. I'm sure there's loads out there, but in terms of the main ones that we'd get over here, you wouldn't you wouldn't see many. But I suppose, with working with the a big chewy spirit and virgin oak, I suppose it's hard to find something that works with that finish,
So in the States, there's a lot of whiskeys that are starting to do finishings.
Mm.
Some have actually started to stick to only making limited releases, and they're all very different finishings. There's a whiskey company out there. It starts with a P. Look it up. It's American and it's Peerless. I didn't say that. Their whole production line is just around different finishings.
Hmm.
Um, it blows my mind the amount of different finishes they do per release, because I mean there was one time they released 7 different labels in one year. And in my mind, I'm like, wow, that's a lot. Tried a few of them. I thought they were pretty interesting. Tried some other ones, might not have been to my palate, but might be to someone else's. And that's
Hmm.
kind of the beauty of just whiskey in general. No matter where you drink it in the world, it's kind of, if you like what's in there, enjoy it. Don't really worry about any kind of ridicule from any quote unquote purist or enthusiast. The whole
Hmm.
idea is it's, collect friends, not whiskey, right? Um,
Exactly.
but to answer the question, I did not find the bottle count. I do know it was very low.
Hmm.
I think it was lower than we do our bootlegs. So our bootlegs usually production size are about 3,000 to 3,200 bottles, and I believe the Redbreast was below that. If that
Mm.
gives at least a range.
Yeah. No, I know. I don't. I can't recall the exact figure, but I know that the volume we got in was in the hundreds rather than thousands. So it is. Yeah.
All right.
And not that that speaks to overall volume, but it was very very limited. Hence why it sold very very quickly out on our website. Um, Oshin has a comment saying about, prior to this being finished in Redbreast, which Heaven's Door would it be closest to flavor wise in terms of comparison? Would it be the straight bourbon, the Tennessee bourbon, or?
It would, yeah, it would be close to the Tennessee bourbon. There's a couple little variances, but overall, as kind of the structure, it's very similar to the bourbon, the first one we tried.
Mhm.
But
Um,
as we all know, even like the smallest point or the smallest point change in a percentage can vastly change the flavor of the whiskey.
yeah,
Now, with that being said, it does have similarities.
fantastic. Alan says Dylan has an episode on Teen Time Radio show all about whiskey. I'd recommend tracking it down and listening to while sipping a dram or two. And speaking of Dylan, do you want to talk a bit more? I know you touched on the Red Robin, but on the
On the
we will
bottles
come
of
to
wine.
Dylan's the bottle
Yeah.
design, the gates,
The thing, the
obviously
thing, the
Dylan's
thing he talks
metal
about
work.
doing. Yes, most definitely. And definitely look up that episode. I've actually not even had a chance to watch that episode, but I've heard ravings about it. He does a lot of kind of radio episodes. There's a collection of them out there.
Mhm.
So for those that are Dylan fans, go out there and check them out. They're pretty interesting. I've only gotten to listen to a few of them. I haven't gotten to the whiskey one yet. But as I said, your samples are in a small clear glass, but our bottles carry a little bit more of a different front facade. And they're these gates. I'll show you one of our limited releases because it's a different bottle. But because Bob Dylan has been touring for 50 plus years, the only project he's ever done outside of music is this whiskey. But he also takes these found metal pieces And this is more of a keeping the creative gears going. And then he'd repurpose these metal pieces into these big, beautiful metal installations, some of them the size of ranch gates. Sometimes he would auction those off, 100% of those proceeds going to rural farmers, because he comes from a private farming town, and believes in, generational growth rather than, big companies taking things over. We put these on our model mainly because our goal is to reciprocate that sentiment, not just to celebrate one of our founders, but also that idea of giving back. So in September and October, we tend to do a programming called #ServeSomebody. Currently, we do different nonprofits to find our way to give back to the community. But off record, I am officially trying to find a way to take care of bartenders a little more, because as being a bartender myself for quite some time, they tend to be the most underappreciated that you see from day to day. They're kind of single serving friends, just not on a plane or on an awesome movie. It's like, you're the best. And it's like, cool, I appreciate you telling me and the next 9 people you see, they're the best. But these people put a lot of time and effort into their craft. It truly is an art. And it truly does take a lot of unseen time. 90% of what they're doing, you're only seeing the 10% of it. So hopefully as we grow, we'll get our way to celebrating those bartenders and giving back to those that pour us. And that's kind of the goal. That's kind of that mirror. We really like to kind of have that mirror of ideologies. And that's what the gates are there for. The gates are, something he does, but it also comes from something quite beautiful. So we want to put them up to not only celebrate him, but then also our journey at trying to get to our way of giving back and finding our voice in that.
No, that's fantastic. I really like what you were saying about the bartenders. It is definitely the case where everyone's your best pal until you no longer work in that bar, and you rock in there a week later and they're like, oh, you're that guy, hi. It's like, as you say, single-use friends, or single-serve friends, whatever it is. But I was lucky enough to see some of Dylan's Gates at an exhibition in London a few years back, and they're really, really impressive in person. The bottles are beautiful, but they really don't give the scale and the intricacy of the metalwork justice, they can
be medium to very, very big. I mean, there's some interesting sizes, and their patternings are beautiful.
No, they really are. There's a great question from Barry here, and maybe what I'll do is, normally at the end of these, we ask everyone what their favorite of the whiskeys we've tasted is. So I will ask everyone listening to post in the chat what your favorite one is, but maybe post it along with your favorite Dylan album, which was the conversation myself and Austin started with. So that might be a nice bookend. And while people are typing that in, we might answer Barry's question about Dylan's involvement in the day-to-day running of the project and the selecting of the whiskies.
So we talked about it earlier, Luke, but
excuse me.
So Bob Dylan is 80 years old now. Been touring the world for 50 plus years, made it through COVID, which is really impressive at that age. But also, he is a recluse. This is a man known for his beautiful lyrics, got a Nobel Prize for literature. So he is very much involved in how this doesn't get bottled until approved by all 3 founders talking with one another. So he is involved with Mark and Ryan. Those are the only 2 people he actually speaks with. Once we decide to move on to another project, or we want to create a single release or a limited release. If we want to change any of the formulas in our core line, they all talk, they all taste, they all really delve into these things in a very in-depth, detailed manner. So yes, he does work with both Mark and Ryan on every bottling that we've ever put out.
No, fantastic. We got a few answers in. Tim's decided not to pick a whiskey and just said Blonde on Blonde. That's a cracking album. Branko's then was the opposite, where he's gone with the double barrel, unless there's another Dylan album called Double Barrel I'm not aware of. But
not what I know of.
Alan's also gone with the double barrel and Blood on the Tracks. Blood on the Tracks is a phenomenal album. Alison Kelly says Love and Mercy, and she loved the straight rye. Henry Kinch's bourbon, which is Tennessee straight bourbon. Martin Fay says, I tasted a double barrel previously and it's my favorite of the bourbons, but that straight rye is special and it's going right into my must buy list. So fantastic. And Rob says straight rye without a doubt. So that's fantastic. Frank then says straight rye as well. So I thought Double Barrel was going to run away with it there, Austin, but the straight rye has come back with a with a vengeance.
I'm really impressed. I thought the Double Barrel was going to take it too. This
interesting.
Awesome.
Interesting that no one has said the Redbreast one either. So but there you go.
Which is this one's my favorite, right, of the four.
Yeah, I mean, considering I know people who've bought these tasting packs, especially so they could try the Redbreast one because they weren't able to buy the bottle. So it's interesting that no one's mentioned it, but that doesn't mean it's still a great whiskey. Just means people preferred the other ones, which says a lot for your brand, like as well. Like that they didn't go for the one that was the most sought after one on here. So yeah, Lisa says Double Barrel and Kieran says straight rye. So I think we'll call it a tie between the Double Barrel and straight rye. What do you reckon?
I'm gonna have to agree. Oh, hey, we got a Redbreast.
Redbreast followed by straight rye and close second.
But I think the rye.
Alan's come with the Redbreast finish. Christmas in the Heart is his favorite Dylan album. That's an interesting one. It's one that I do play a lot around Christmas, but it's more ironically because of the kitschness of it, But so yeah, brilliant.
So one thing I will say for those of you that ever come into the States, one of the Redbreast barrels that we finish this whiskey in actually sits in Dallas, Texas, in a downtown restaurant in the basement. It's 132 gallon. And they have since now barreled an old fashioned in this massive barrel that we originally finished this beautiful bottling in. So something that's a really good treat. It's the only place in the US that has that barrel. And so it'd be really cool if you do make your way to get to see that Redbreast Heaven's Door collaboration barrel live and actually still being used.
And is the basement open to the public, or do you have to pretend to be going to the bathroom and sneak down some stairs? Or
no, surprisingly enough, that's actually the entrance. You have to go. It's only one elevator that sticks above ground, and
okay,
right when you go down, the barrel's right in front of you.
Brilliant. No, that's fantastic. For what it's worth, I think Planet Waves is my favorite, but I'm a big fan of Blood in the Tracks as well. I think Planet Waves is one of his early, well, it's not early, it was the 70s, but it's one that doesn't get enough credit. It's a cracking album, but there you go. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Austin. It's been fantastic. I really enjoyed it.
I really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun. Love to do it again.
No, definitely. We definitely will. If there's any more, maybe with them when the next collaboration comes out or something, we can definitely do more. As we mentioned previously on these tastings, even as we slowly tentatively emerge out of COVID, these are probably not going to go anywhere because they've proved, it's a great way for bringing people together. Pandemic or no pandemic, we used to do them in-house, and there was like the same fantastic people used to come every month, but now we're able to reach people all over, including back where you are in the States. So yeah, no, it's fantastic. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Austin. Is there anything you want to say before you go, or?
I mean, only thing I'll say for those of you new to the American whiskey category, the idea of American whiskey, this is almost a little preachy, so my apologies. It's very indicative of the idea of true Americana. It's a multitude of different things from different areas coming together to create a singular thing. And so it's a really fun, prideful spirit for people in the States. But also, don't chase the number. Just grab a bottle if you're curious. If it seems like something you might want, get it, try it, or go to your local pub, order it, sip it, and then get into it. Don't worry about the age statement. Don't worry about the bottling. Don't worry about if your friend's going to make fun of you for drinking something that isn't cool. Just enjoy it and really collect friends, not whiskey. So cheers.
No, brilliant. We'll drink to that. Thank you, Austin. And thanks, guys. If there's anything we missed or any questions you think of tonight, you can drop an email to a reply to the email that sent out the Zoom link, and we'll get it answered. We'll pass it on to Austin if needs be. So thanks, Austin. We'll talk soon. Cheers. Bye.